we're on to actually connecting to the database and doing some work. So the first thing we need to do is we need to create an instance of our WSAD. I'm going to open up my models and data. I need to create an instance of my DB context, my WSAD DB context. So to do that, we would typically just write WSAD DB context, and I'm just going to call it context and say equals, and we need to create an instance of this class, so we need to create a new WSAD DB context. Now, this line will work perfectly fine. No problems. It'll work great. The caveat here is that your DB context is considered a unmanaged resource. And what that means is that that database connection that's going to be created is something that's a low level system resource that actually requires the operating system to open up network ports and do a lot of like inner plumbing to make all of that work. Well, within the .NET framework, if you recall, you have a process called garbage collection, and garbage collection will go in and it'll delete out objects you're not using and clean things up, and that works great. The catch is that that runs when it wants to run. So if you're opening and closing database connections, you want to make sure that you're closing and releasing them as fast as possible, because otherwise you end up with all of these database connections that are basically just sitting out there and not being used. And that can end up adding to memory pressure on your computer or on your server. That can end up adding network pressure in terms of open connections. And while most servers can have a very high number of connections, there still is a limit. So you want to make sure that you're being good stewards of your resources and that you're actually releasing those connections when you're done. So to do that, because DB context implements what's called iDisposable, and I'll show you that here, we'll jump into our class, and then we're actually going to jump into the signature of DB context. Now this is Visual Studio looking at the DB context object and then inferring some stuff. If we actually expand any of these, you'll see that there's no code. These are just simply headers or kind of blueprints of the functions and methods within DB context. But it also shows us the inheritance lineage for the context. So iDisposable is one of those pieces, and you'll notice here in the description it says provides a mechanism for releasing unmanaged resources. Now you can go and read up on iDisposable if you're interested, but that's all I need to know for me to do this next step. And what I want to do here is I want to actually wrap this in a using statement. Now what a using statement does is it says anything that is using my WSAD DB context will happen inside of these curly brackets. Kind of looks like an if statement, but it's using. And what happens is that it's going to create my WSAD DB context. And then my DB context will only exist within the context or within the curly brackets. And then once I hit here outside the curly brackets, then my context is no longer there. It gets disposed of, the resources get cleared or released, and then memory gets returned back to the system and everybody's happy. So if you're using a database connection, you have to make sure that if you're making it a using statement, then you need to make sure that you're doing all of that database work within that using statement. So certain lines here, like making sure the username is unique, has to happen in there. The creating of the object needs to happen in there. The adding to the context happens in there, and saving the changes also happens in there. So all of these steps have to happen inside of this using statement. If it happens outside this using statement, then it will throw an error and say that context has a null reference. All right, so now that we have our context, we can start making calls to it. And the context is an object just like any other. And if you remember, in our context, if we peek in here real fast, we have our DB set for users. That's what we're going to be interacting or working with. So first thing is our username unique? So we'll say context dot users, that's our property. And then part of the entity framework, we have a series of utility methods, and they mimic SQL statements. So we'll see things in here like where, or we'll see things in here like select, or we'll see things in here like join, order by. So all of these are in here to provide us that SQL-based functionality, but at a programmatic level. and they all act as functions. So that you use them as functions, and they actually can be chained together, which is nice, and you'll see that in later lectures. So to start here, what I want to say is, are there any users with the username that matches the new user's username? So to do that, I'm going to actually use the any method. And what that does is it goes out to the database and it checks, and it returns true or false whether or not the statement is true. Now, the statement that goes inside of here is a lambda expression. And the idea here is that you need to create a function that returns true or false. Now, lambda expressions are really shorthand functions, and the way that I like to describe them is you start off with a variable, and I'm going to actually break this into separate lines so you can read it more clearly. Typically, you'd write it all as one line, and they're usually pretty short, but just for clarity, you start with a variable, and that variable in this case represents a row out of the database. Now, row becomes our input parameter to our function. So then we use an arrow, and then we will say that row dot username, right? Because in that row, there's a username column, and if that username equals, and then in our case, we're going to say new user, which is the data coming from our form, dot username. And equals returns a Boolean to say, yes, that username equals the new user's username, or false, it doesn't equal that. And this is actually going to go through and check every row. But it's doing it as a SQL statement, so what this turns into is select star from TBL users where username equals and the new user's username. So what this is going to do for us is it's going to do that check. Now, with that, we can wrap this all inside of an if statement, and we can say if there are any, and the way you would read that is if there are any users in our database where the row has a username that equals our new user, then we need to do something. So basically, if there's a row in our database that has that username, then we need to tell the user, sorry, that username already exists. So we'll use our model state dot add model error. Username already exists. Try again. And then we'll return the view, and we'll say new user. And I'm actually going to make an adjustment to the new user. I'm going to say the username equals an empty string. I'm basically resetting the username back to a blank because I want to make that user type in a new username. And since we mark it as required, they won't be able to leave the form until they put in a new username. We can also be a little more descriptive here in case they're like, oh, I don't remember what I typed in. We can actually say new user.username, so they know what username that they typed in that already exists. All right, so that'll be a good check. And like I said before, this typically all falls on one single line. And that way it's a little easier to kind of read and consume. It all gets jammed in there, so it does get a little tight, and that's why I wanted to break it out for you. But that's how you would typically see it in a block of code. All right, so let's go ahead and create our user DTO, or data transfer object, that will actually pass into our DB context. Now, there's a lot of ways to approach this, and I'm going to show you my recommended method, and that has to do with doing inline initialization. Do is we'll first declare a variable that will be a user, and this will be our new user DTO, and we'll set it equal to a new user object. Now, instead of doing semicolon, what we'll do is we'll do curly brackets, and what this allows us to do is that we can actually come in here, and I'm going to push Control Spacebar, and this will pop up all of the properties in our user object. So we can go through now and we can actually just set each one of these properties by copying values out of our new user view model object. Now, to start, we'll do username, so we'll say new user dot first name, comma, and now last name equals new user dot last name. So as you're looking at this, what you're seeing is we're setting the value or the property of the new user DTO, and we're taking the value out of the new user view model object and putting it into each one of those properties. So basically we're passing values between the two. So is active will be true, is admin will be false, the username will be new user.username, and the password will be new user.password. And the last thing we need to set is the date created, which will be datetime.now, and date modified will also be datetime.now. All right. So we've now created our new user DTO, and then we simply say context.users.add. So we're adding a new user to the users DB set, and we're passing in the new user DTO. Now, before I click this and move out of the IntelliSense that's showing up here, notice that when we call this method, add, it actually returns to us a user object. And the difference is that we're passing in what's referred to as a POCO, which is a plain old CLR or .NET object. And what it's going to return back to us is a smart object. And basically what happens is the object that's returned is linked to the database record. It has the ID for the newly entered record. It also has what's called proxying functionality, so that if changes are made to the DTO after we do the add and then do the save, then those changes are actually tracked and they'll be saved to the database. So that's how you get kind of that nice hybrid of object-oriented programming with database functionality, is that the Entity Framework actually creates these proxy classes that track changes that are being made to the object, so it knows what kind of update statements to write back to the database to keep things in sync. All right, and then the last step, and this is one people often miss, is that we have to say context.saveChanges. And without calling save changes, the add basically gets ignored, and that never actually gets committed to the database. So think of save changes as running that insert statement. All right, so we've now created a new user object, and the last thing we'll do is return redirect. And I'm going to redirect to action, and I'm going to redirect to the login action. All right, so that is our account controller functionality. So let's go ahead and test it real quick. And to do that, I'm going to first jump into my Server Explorer. I'm going to open up my database. And then I'm going to open up my TBL user table. And I'm going to right click on it this time. And I'm going to choose Show Table Data. Now once this opens, I actually hand keyed in a record earlier. So I'm going to go ahead and start by deleting it. So I'm going to click on this arrow next to it. Click on the row, right click on the row, and then hit delete. It'll warn me about the deletion. I'll hit yes, and now I have an empty table. So I'll go ahead and run my app. And we'll go through and actually create a user. All right, so we're going to go to /account/create. And from here, we will create our first user. All right, so I'm just going to create myself. And we'll hit create. And if everything is successful, we'll get brought back to the login page. And in the next video, we will work on doing login. But for now, let's jump back into Visual Studio and let's refresh our TBL user table. And there is our record, created successfully. So we've now gone through and we've created a create form, and we're actually taking that data now and we're saving it to our database.